Good evening and welcome to the Board of Education. This is our special meeting, a relatively short meeting of April 8th, 2019. Anyone who's in the audience, if you want to follow along with our agenda, we have them out on the table outside the door to the right. There's also blue slips there if you'd like to address the board during audience communication. For those following at home, you can go to our website, livoniapublicschools.org, highlight over the board tab, and drop down to agendas, and you can follow along with us. As I indicated, we only have really one item on the agenda tonight. So, Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Here.
Mrs. Burton?
Here.
Mr. Centers?
Here.
Mrs. Frank?
Here.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Here.
Mrs. Bonifield is here. President Johnson?
Here, we have a quorum. That takes us to item 2, audience communication. I do not have a blue slip. Don't see anyone rushing to the podium again tonight, so we will move on to item 3, which is approval to change attendance area of Kennedy and Randolph Elementary Schools. May I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bradford.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District approve that the area west of Wayne Road and north of Central City Parkway, bordered by the Morgan Drain on the west and north, be designated for student attendance to Kennedy Elementary School, encompassing the residential developments of Colonial Village, Greenwood Villa, and Rivergate Drive condominiums.
Support.
I have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Burton. And Mrs. Scott, you're going to help us with this tonight, I see.
I am. Thank you, President Johnson. As was discussed at the March 18th Committee of the Whole, we are continuously looking at school enrollment and the fluctuations that occur with the potential for the future. Randolph and Kennedy are both in the Churchill Triad, and a pattern has been noticed by the principals during these last 2 years. Enrollment at Randolph has been steadily increasing, while at Kennedy there has been a slight decline. Randolph has increased by 24 students since November of 2017 to the present, while in the same time frame, Kennedy has decreased by 45 students. Enrollment at Randolph is expected to continue to increase due to population trends and housing developments within the Randolph's current attendance area. We are proposing that the residential developments of Colonial Village, Rivergate Drive condominiums, and Greenwood Villa be moved to Kennedy Elementary, beginning for the 2019-20 school year. This shift in the attendance area will assist in balancing the pupil enrollment between the two schools and positively impact the transportation times for those students affected. As always, the level of support and care will continue for all students regardless of their school assignment. We continuously look at that each year and sometimes several times during the year in order to balance the need for those schools.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott. Do I have questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Burton.
Yes, Mrs. Scott, thank you for all of the extensive work that you've done on this, not only on your behalf and that of the administrative group at central office, but also the
Right.
principals involved.
Yeah, thank you.
Something that is very significant to me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I understand that every parent who has a student who may be impacted in terms of their students moving from one building to the other has received a personal phone call from their principal.
Correct.
To have discussion about this potential situation.
You're correct. Mr. Daraskovich, the principal at Randolph, reached out to each one of the families involved that would be impacted at these 3 development sites, and was able to have direct communication with them to talk with them about why this was being proposed, and to assure them that that their children were going to be taken care of. The parents were very appreciative of being reached out to, not just by a letter, but also that personal contact, and feeling like that both Kennedy and Randolph were great schools, and they would be happy at either one of the schools. So,
And both Kennedy and Randolph feed into the same 5-6, being Johnson and on up middle school and high school. So there's no change in the path for the students throughout their experience in LPS.
you are correct. They're in the same triad.
Okay. The other very significant piece to me, and there's many factors to discuss, but is the fact that the bus ride for these students would be significantly cut back, which is something that we're always shooting for with our elementaries, with any of our students, but particularly with our youngest ones.
It would be reduced anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes each way.
Okay, alrighty. There's other things to chat about, but I'm going to let some of my colleagues also jump in.
Okay.
So Mrs. Bradford throw up her hand.
Thank you. Can you tell us how many families this particular move would affect for the 1920 school year?
If all students were to move, it would impact 32 families. So within those 32 families, it would be 36 students.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments? Mrs.
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask Mrs. Scott to spend just a couple of minutes with regard to the analyzing the principals did and that you did with regard to the students who currently attend Randolph and the allowance for the upcoming fourth grade students for next year.
We have 12 fourth grade students, and there was conversation between Mr. Draskovich and especially those families that if they would like their student that's going to be a fourth grader next year, that they could stay at Randolph for that year. And there were only a couple of them who said, yes, I want to stay at Randolph. Others said, they would decide at a later time.
Thank you.
Mrs. Bonifield, you had.
Were there any of the students in this area that were impacted by the closure of Grant?
The closure of
Or
Garfield.
Garfield, sorry.
Yes, there were a few that were impacted, and so that was taken into consideration. So that's why, especially some of those fourth graders, I think there's only one third grader who would potentially be impacted, but all the rest of them were fourth graders.
And is it my understanding that there was some consideration made for possibly allowing them to stay?
Yes, those fourth graders, especially those, because we understand that the change in schools can be traumatic for a family and for students, and so they looked very carefully. Randolph looked at where they had been, like if they had started at Garfield and then they had to switch to Randolph, and then if they were going to be one of them, the ones to switch to Kennedy. And again, most of them who were going to be impacted were fourth graders.
Okay. But there was, there was the same, for the one third grader, were they able to decide whether or not to stay?
I think that third grader had decided that they would want to go if that was an option.
They would want to move to Kennedy?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think part of the conversation also was that, they would know when they go to Johnson, they will all be going to Johnson.
Yeah.
And that they would, they would end up being able to know even more students, potentially if they end up making the move. Even though, again, we know that it's difficult for families to make this kind of transition.
Okay.
And the fourth graders would not have to.
Okay.
Mr. Centers.
Can you speak briefly about the analysis the two principals did together as far as accommodations and classrooms and making sure everyone is, if this move takes place, that we can fit everyone, accommodate them in the current, the schools that they'll be transferring to?
Yes, when looking at that, we were able to look at exactly what the class sizes are at Kennedy. And again, sometimes class sizes, they go up and down depending upon how many students and how many classes that you end up with. And this year, it's very easy for them to be able to have more students within the configuration that they have and not end up, looking at having combination classrooms for Kennedy. And this year, Randolph ended up with 5 kindergartens, and that's quite significant for a school to end up with 5.
As far as space concerns, though, Kennedy is more than enough classroom space to absorb this transfer.
Yes, the principal at Kennedy assures me that we have at least 2 classrooms that she could have and use.
Thank you.
Yes, Mrs. Frank.
I appreciate all of the research that you did and all of the analysis that your staff gave us whenever we were looking at this at the study session and at the committee of the whole, and we talked about a lot of this information, and it was so great to see it on paper and to see what the numbers looked like and to see that this is going to be beneficial for both schools, actually, to be able to even out kind of the schools in terms of build it up to its capacity at Kennedy. But I just wanted to be clear, and I know that we've said this in every meeting, but just to, again, say, this is not going to affect any of the center students at Randolph, correct?
That is correct. We would not be looking at moving the center resource room at all.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments? Mrs. Burke?
The fourth graders who are choosing, the fourth graders who would be in any of these 3 apartment complexes are the ones that are being offered to be grandfathered in, that they can stay at Randolph if their family so chose, or they can go to Kennedy. And do I understand correctly that either way, transportation for this year would be provided for either decision?
For 2019-20 school year, if they're grandfathered in, they would get transportation to whichever building they are choosing to go to. LPS will continue to provide that for those 19-20 fourth graders.
Right, because that is the only year that we would have.
That'd be the only year we're doing.
And then after that, the kids would be going on to Johnson anyway, so,
Correct.
okay. And again, just for the benefit of the public, we are only talking about these 3 apartment complexes. And some of the surrounding apartment complexes already go to Kennedy anyway. But we are not talking about making any other major boundary changes or in either Randolph or Kennedy. We are strictly talking about these apartment complexes. And we defined it geographically by the roads and the storm drain and so forth, but.
Yep. You are correct. Woodcrest currently goes to Kennedy,
Okay,
which is right next door to Colonial.
okay. As far as student services, we had some discussion about the student services at a prior meeting, but just so folks are aware also, the student services, whatever services they need, gen ed, special services, et cetera, anything on the whole spectrum, that would not change based on what building they are going to be in. It's my understanding that students who have need for certain services would receive them regardless of what building they're in. And if students are moving from one building to another, the appropriate number of services are also going to be shifted to wherever the students are. Is that correct?
That's correct. Allocations are always made dependent upon student needs, student numbers, the number of hours needed, all sorts of things go into that. So no matter where it is that any student is, the services would follow.
Okay. And again, back to your discussion just a moment ago about classes. It's my understanding, looking at the information you provided to us at the prior meeting about the breakout of classes right now, this move has while its primary purpose was not for this, but it has a side benefit of alleviating some of the potential split classes that we'd be looking at next year, because we would be having enough students coming in that they would round out 2 classes and alleviate the need for a split class instead.
You're correct.
Okay.
Yes. Sometimes the class sizes, the number of students, don't end up showing up, and so then the numbers, drastically reduce, and so there's always a little bit of that angst, when we begin that staffing of whether or not what will happen, within the numbers. So.
But from what we know right now, and like you said, we can't tell who may move in or out in the summertime, but from what we know right now, this would help alleviate a split class situation.
Correct.
Okay. Again, to me, the biggest factor is if this is going to help even out some of these buildings, if our students are going to be receiving the same services that they would need regardless of which building they're going to be in, if it's going to reduce their transportation time, and if the families are either neutral or supportive of the decision, this is for me, this is going to be the easiest boundary change I have ever supported in Livonia Public Schools, because usually it comes with a great amount of angst. But for me, this is a win-win all the way around.
Yeah, and we have, the good thing is that we have 2 wonderful school communities. We have 2 principals and staff who are very well vested into their students and what it is that their school needs, and they're not afraid to advocate for what their school needs. So, that's a lot of good things. And families that have been, more than welcoming of all students. that are in their schools.
Mrs. Scott, my last question is, if this does pass this board vote tonight, can you tell me and tell the community what they could expect from, if they are one of the families that are impacted in this move, what they could expect as next steps?
And that's one thing that has been talked about quite a bit, especially between the two principals, of kind of like Mr. Doraskovich called and had the conversation, with each one of the families. So in turn, Dr. Daniels, who's the principal at Kennedy, would make those personal connections and find ways to welcome new students into Kennedy, just as was done a couple years ago. So she already has lots of ideas that she's ready to talk about as soon as if this comes to be. And I know that she has a wonderful PTA at Kennedy who's always been very welcoming and helpful, with any type of transition that has occurred.
Okay, so there would be transition activities for these students and their families prior to the end of this school year.
Correct.
They're going in September is not going to be the first experience at their new school.
Right, as well as invitations to attend other, a lot of the activities, that are already occurring at Kennedy. I'm sure we see those types of e-blasts occurring all the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Burton. Other questions, comments from the board? Seeing none, I don't have anything to add. I think it's all been addressed. So, Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
And since that was the only item on the agenda, is there any other business to be brought before the board? Seeing none, then we are adjourned. Thank you.